Señoras y señores, muy buenos días. La aeronáutica.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Aeronáutica Civil and the Center for Aeronautical Studies welcomes you to this conference about the alternative of a procurement model for airports. It is led by Mr. Miguel Southwell, who is a representative of the ACI, Airports Council International, and an expert in this matter. This event has as the purpose to present a hybrid alternative between the airport management model and the government management model, which is the privatization. And this is an administration agreement in light of a management agreement where the owner, the government that is, keeps control of the airport and assigns the operations to a professional company of airport management. Today, we have for the opening of this event Dr. Olga Lucía Ramirez, Vice President of Infrastructure, Vice Minister of Infrastructure, and the Director in charge of Aeronáutica Civil of Colombia. We also have Mr. Miguel Southwell, President and CEO of Bracken Aviation Management, who we'd like to welcome. At this moment, we'd like to give a special welcome to all of the members of GLAC, ICAO, and the national and international industry that are joining us at this moment. Before getting started, bear in mind the following recommendations. In case of using the interpretation service, you will find on the bottom of your screen the button that will allow you to have access to the interpretation service. Choose your preferred language and you will listen to the translated version as per your wishes. We remind you that the participants cannot speak directly. The team will be looking after the questions that are sent through the chat, and we will be bringing them to the speaker. To get started, you will be addressed by the Dr. Olga Lucía Ramirez, Director of Aeronáutica Civil. Good morning and welcome. Thank you very much, Lina, and good morning to everybody. Today, I have the pleasure of being able to join you and to present this very important conference that has been organized by the Aeronáutica Civil. Is an entity that it is my honor now from yesterday to be leading this entity. And I just wanted to stop by to give you my greetings, and I want to thank you for your participation.
Thank you very much for sharing this space with us. We are very honored with your participation and excited to hear from you about this alternative of a management agreement model for our airports with its advantages and disadvantages. So please welcome, and we are very pleased to have you here. And I'm going to switch to Spanish again. Como ustedes saben,
As you might know, for Colombia, it's truly important to highlight that has been one of the pioneer countries in implementing from the mid-90s management and airport administration models with private participation through the concession contracts that are ongoing today that have allowed for many years now to deliver and to give the private enterprise all of the management, modernization, and development of the airport infrastructure of the main air domes of the country. And it is worthwhile to mention that it is more than 90% of the passenger and cargo traffic. It is important to tell you that since the year 1995, when the first concession contract was allocated for the construction and the operation of the second runway of El Dorado Airport, we have had a series of variations and different contracting models that have allowed us to generate experiences and, of course, many lessons learned in the institutional framework as well as the contractual framework and in the development and modernization of the airport infrastructure in the country. Regarding the institutional framework, I just want to tell you that we've moved forward with the creation and consolidation of a specialized unit that in Colombia is the National Agency of Infrastructure, ANI, that designs and structures the concessions of infrastructure for the transport sector overall, which includes, of course, the airport infrastructure. And this is an entity that works in a coordinated fashion with the national government, directly with the Aeronáutica Civil, with the Civil Aviation Authority, where we identify where is the best model, what is the best implementation, and the opportunities that foster this participation and that generate a proper management development of all of the airports, and at the same time is in charge of managing the concession contracts that are being executed. In terms of the contractual framework, I want to say that we have moved forward from the first generation contracts, such as the landing strips of the Bogota airport, the contract in Cartagena, Rafael Núñez, Barranquilla as well, that were entered into in the year 1996, and we have been moving forward to more elaborated models in Aerocali, for instance, which is the second generation, the year in 2000, eventually the airport of San Andres and the concession of Opain in the year 2007. And this has brought transformation and modernization of the airport infrastructure that I believe we have all seen. So in this contract evolution, we now see another model that has been the group of airports that we have it in the North Central with Airplan Operator that leads 6 airports in the North Central region of the country, Jose Maria Córdoba and Olaya Herrera airports for the city of Medellín. We also have Quibdó, Apartado, Corozal. We have the concessionaire Nororiente that manages and administers other 6 airport terminals, where we highlight Bucaramanga, Cúcuta, Santa Marta, Barranca Bermeja, Valledupar, and Riohacha. So I just say this because all of the experience, accumulated experience, has enabled us as a government, and particularly the National Infrastructure Agency, during the current administration, look at new progress that allow to improve these contracts, to profile the latest generation contracts, and we expect them to contribute positively in this work of airport management, promoting the private participation. We cannot refrain from saying that, unfortunately, as a cause or as a consequence of the pandemic COVID-19 that affects all of us, and with greater intensity, we know that the airport industry is one of the most affected, and air transport as well. We have seen some impact on the schedules for the development of the investment in infrastructure and the development of airport operations. But we have already been, as the government, taking the necessary measures. We've been addressing this, and specifically for the San Andres airport. Under this context, I just want to say, and I'm speaking as Vice Minister and Director in charge of the CAA, and now talking from Aerocivil. Aerocivil has considered that is the time to have a better analysis for the airport management contracts, to explore and to analyze what models do we have available in the world. It is important to see and open our eyes, see what's outside of Colombia in the world. And what gathers us here today is to analyze and explore this new alternative, which is the contract for airport management that could be very proper to have enhancements and improvements on the management and the operations of some of the airports in our country that are strategic for the connectivity in the regions, still show traffic levels that are not as high as some other airports are, and that could attract private investment through other contract models, not the concession contracts. And for that, we require an additional work of promotion and trading and driving this development. But at the same time, and it is very important to us, aside from promoting the development, it is important for the Aeronáutica Civil and for the mission to always guarantee and assure the security and the safety of the operations, and always to be efficient, be cost efficient within our administration, with a better process, a streamlined process, and proper management of the infrastructure. And that is the purpose for today. That's why Mr. Miguel Southwell is joining us, representing Airport Council International, who I'd like to thank personally, and I like to convey a very warm welcome to you. He will be presenting during the presentation the structure, the features, and all of the essential elements that at the international level make up this administration contract model for airports, so that we can see in depth this alternative, and that we have better judgment elements to assess our options, to weigh out our alternatives and the pertinence of this option for the Colombian case as an alternative that allows us to improve and to see greater efficiency in the management of some airports that are owned by the nation, and the administration still is under Aerocivil. Aerocivil, I want to say, has evolved and has improved quite a bit. I have been able to see the evolution in terms of the management and the operation of the airports. But as I said before, I've always been a force, and Juan Carlos and all of the entity, to explore alternatives, and that's why we are very pleased to assess this alternative. Once again, welcome to everybody. Um, Thank you very much, Director, for your comments. We'd like to remind all of the participants that are just joining us right now at this moment that on the bottom of your screen on the Zoom application, you will see a world icon where you will be able to have access to simultaneous interpretation. You can choose English or Spanish as you desire, or you can remain on the original audio in order to be able to choose your language, this service that we have, interpretation. And to dive into the matter, we like to greet our speaker, Mr. Miguel Southwell, and we want to do a quick intro of who Miguel is. Miguel currently acts as President and CEO of Bracken Aviation Management, a global consulting firm for air transport management based out of Atlanta, Georgia. Is in US, South America, Caribbean, and Africa. His aviation career is for more than 40 years, starting with the regional Caribbean airline Liad in 1973, climbing to become the Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport chief, the most concurred airport passenger with more than 100 million passengers per year and a combined budget of $1 million for operations and capital. During his leadership in Atlanta Airport in 2006, Mr. Southwell was appointed CEO of the Year in the city by the Atlanta Business League and Atlanta Business Journal. Before his leadership in the Atlanta airport, Mr. Southwell actually performed as the executive of the regional bank, overseeing 16 branches in Portland, Oregon, in the United States. Was deputy director of the International Miami Airport, and before Miami Airport, he led the Department of Business and Finance of the Atlanta Airport. Has also worked as attached professor of State University of Georgia, where he taught courses of airport management and airlines for 5 years. Mr. Southwell has taught classes in seminars in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. That's how we want to welcome Mr. Southwell. Mr. Southwell, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Lena, for that kind introduction. And good day to everyone who's joining us today. It is both a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today. I look forward to sharing the results of this important work that we have been doing with Aerocivil over the past year to examine an alternative for best practices in the operation of airports in the Republic of Colombia. But first, I wish to thank the former Director General of Aerocivil, Mr. Juan Carlos Salazar, for the vision and leadership that he brought to the project, and for giving Airports Council International the opportunity to work with this amazing team at Aerocivil. For those of you in the audience who may not be familiar with Airports Council International, it is the only global association of airports with over 1,800 airport members across 5 regions that include Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean, as well as North America. I wish to also take this opportunity to thank and welcome the new Director General of Aerocivil, Dr. Olga Lucia Ramirez, and look forward to her distinguished leadership at Aerocivil. Many members of the Aerocivil team worked tirelessly in support of this project, but I would be negligent if I did not mention 4 people in particular. First, Dr. Claudia Esquerra, for her leadership of the technical team. Second, Attorney Miriam Ayala Tamayo for her brilliant legal mind. Third, Mr. Jaime Cortez Guerrero for his guidance and extensive expertise in airport operations. And lastly, Ms. Stephanie Maritza Martinez Varon, whose translation skills and analytical skills contributed greatly to the success of this project and to the timely completion of the schedule. My thanks to all of you, and a warm welcome to all of you for joining us today. Now, I would like to get into the presentation, and to do that, let me start the presentation. First, the agenda. Today, we have done the welcome and introductions, and I will start next by talking about the purpose of the conference, why we're all here today. The Director General did a very good job and an outstanding job talking about the purpose and why we're here today. Then I'd like to talk about the basic airport organization. How are airports organized? How are they structured? Because regardless of whether it is managed by a government, or it is a privatized, or it's a management agreement, most airports have a standard structure for them to operate properly. You cannot talk about an airport management agreement without looking at the other two types of management models for airports. And those two other models are self-management, where the government runs the airport itself. The other is privatization, which the Director General spoke about. So we'll discuss those two models before we talk about the airport management agreement. And then, of course, we'll discuss what airport management agreements are and how they're structured. Then we will like to discuss how you go about recruiting an airport management company to actually operate the airport. And then we will have your questions and your answers. We'd like you to provide as many questions as you can, and we will try to answer those questions for you. And all of that should take approximately 2 hours. So first, why are we here? We're here to present an alternative, what I would like to think is a hybrid between a government's self-management of an airport and the privatization model. Because we believe that an airport management agreement is a hybrid. It's sort of the in-between of a government running the airport itself and the privatization model. Now, this chart is very difficult to see, but as I said earlier, regardless of what airport management models you use, airports require a certain structure for them to operate properly. Some of these tasks may be centralized, like it is at Air de Seville, but to run an airport, there are approximately 5 different areas that an airport has to have to operate. The first area is the administration. The second area is the information technology. The third area is finance and accounting. The next area is operations and maintenance. And the fifth area is planning, engineering, and asset management. I will speak about each of those 5 departments of the airport separately and more specifically. But in addition to these 5 departments, an airport also has to have a legal affairs division where you have at least an attorney to help you with the legal matters. And an airport also must have a public relations, a public affairs, and governmental affairs division. So in addition to the 5 fundamental departments, an airport must also have a legal department and a public relations, media relations, and governmental relations division. First, let me talk about administration. What do I mean with when I say the administration division of an airport? What do I mean? Within administration, you have human resource management, you have procurement, which is purchasing, and you also have the commercial operations. So let me repeat. Within the administration department of an airport, you have human resources, you have procurement, and you have the commercial division. If you were to define what an administration division does, an administration division of an airport is that part of the airport that provides all of the human resources, the materials, and the technology, as well as funding, revenues, to keep the airport running. Let me repeat that. The administration department of an airport, the purpose of that department is to bring to the airport all the human resources that are required to run the airport, all the material resources, such as purchasing and procuring those materials, as well as financial resources in terms of revenues for the airport. It's one of the most important departments because, of course, without those resources, the rest of the airport cannot operate. Let me talk about human resources. Of course, everyone understands what human resources mean. In the human resource department, they do the recruiting of staff, so they have to recruit new members of staff. They have to deal with payroll to, of course, pay the employees. They also have to deal with employee benefits, like retirement benefits, medical benefits. And they also are the ones that deal with the labor unions. They deal with the labor unions together with the law department, together with the legal department. The HR department also deals with labor unions. Procurement. Everyone understands what procurement is. It's that part of the organization that's within administration that provides all of the material resources that you need. Pencils, computers, pens, vehicles, automobiles. Procurement is involved in purchasing all of the materials, the material things for the airport to operate. And finally, within the administration division is the commercial division. What is the commercial division? The commercial division's responsibility is to grow the revenue, increase the revenue of the airport. That is their sole purpose. Their purpose in the commercial division is to get as much money as possible for the airport. They do that by renting space in the airport for tenant leases for the tenants of the airport. They also operate the food, beverage, and retail concessions, such as duty-free, again, the food, beverage, and retail divisions, and the retail also includes the duty-free. The commercial division also operates the parking. At some airports, parking is the biggest revenue generator. I can tell you, for example, in the airport in Atlanta, parking generates about $140 million a year. about 1/4 of the budget. Most airports in developing countries, parking provides about 1/4 of the revenues for the airport to operate. The commercial division also operates car rentals. Car rental companies that are located in the airport have to pay revenues to the airport. And lastly, the commercial division, their responsibility is also marketing. Now, when we talk about marketing at airports, the main type of marketing, the primary type of marketing that an airport does is air service development. Air service development is the primary marketing activities that airports must engage in and that the commercial division must engage in. Air service development means that you have to identify airlines that have the potential to fly and to that airport and serve that airport. Bear in mind that it is the main driver of airport revenues are the passengers that arrive on the airplanes. So the most important thing for increasing revenues and the marketing activity of an airport is to get as many airlines and as many passengers to serve that particular airport. Many years ago, airports did not have a marketing division, but most of the airports in the world now have a marketing division made up of professionals and consultants who can identify airlines with the best potential to serve that particular airport. So, again, within administration, you have human resources, you have procurement, and you have commercial, which is, commercial is that part of the airport that brings all of the revenue to the airport. The next division, of course, is information technology. In the 21st century, you must have a focus on information technology, because information technology, that division, not just operates the telephones and the computers, but it is that part of the airport that we look to in the future to provide greater efficiency and automation at the airport. So information technology should not be buried under some other division. They should be at a very high level to be at the decision-making, they have to be at a decision-making level for senior management. So we've talked about administration, we've talked about information technology. So those are the two of the main departments that any airport must have. The third department that any airport must have is finance and accounting. And of course, everybody understands what that means. The airport has to pay its bills. It has to submit invoices so that it can be paid by airlines, paid by food, beverage, and retail concessions, paid by the car rental companies. And so you must have a finance and accounting division to manage all of that process. The finance and accounting division also have what we call an internal auditor. And the purpose of an internal auditor is to make sure that there are controls, financial controls within the organization to prevent loss of monies, to make sure that the airport is collecting all the money that is owed to the airport and that there are no unacceptable practices in terms of the airport's finances. So we've talked about administration, we've talked about information technology, and we've talked about finance and accounting. The fourth department that every airport must have, and it's one of the most important departments, is operations and maintenance. Now, we have put those two things together, but you don't have to. You can have operations and you can have maintenance separately. In over 30 years of management at airports, I have discovered that the best structure for an airport is to combine both the operations and maintenance division. And here is why. The purpose of the operations division is to ensure safety and security of passengers, airport users, and equipment into and through the airport. Let me repeat that. The main purpose of the operations division is to be able to move people and equipment through the airport safely and efficiently. That's what operations division does. Well, if the airport is not maintained properly, if there is if there's a spill that takes place in the airport, so there's a water spill that takes place in the airport. If an airplane is being fueled and some of the fuel spills on next to the aircraft, it is the maintenance department that has to come to be summoned and requested to come to clean up these spills. If there's an elevator that breaks, it is the maintenance department that has to come and fix it. Therefore, you should give that authority to operations to be able to request maintenance to do those repairs and clean those spills, because if operations does not have the resource of the maintenance division to do those things, operations will fail in its responsibility to move people and equipment safely through the airport. So now we've talked about the administration department, the IT department, finance and accounting department, operations and maintenance, and the fifth department that every airport has and needs to have is the department that we call planning, engineering, and asset management. Planning, engineering, and asset management. When you think of planning, engineering, and asset management, you think of what is required, what new construction is required to meet the future demands of the airport. So, planning, engineering, and asset management, their responsibility is to primarily look into the future and determine if the airport terminal needs to be expanded, if the runway needs to be extended, if the parking lot where cars park needs to be extended. But the planning, engineering, and asset management department also needs to have a schedule of when to demolish or renew, repair the existing facilities. So there are two types of planning that the planning, engineering, and asset management department needs to do. Planning for the future, for the growth of the airport, but also planning for the renewal of the airport. When I say renewal, when you build a road, when you build a ramp where the planes park, when you build a runway, they have a certain life. They have a certain lifetime before you take a runway, for example. A runway usually lasts 15 to 20 years. And after 15 to 20 years, you have to repave the runway for it to operate properly. So again, planning does two types of things. They plan to expand the airport for future growth, but they also do the planning for the renewal of the existing facility. I also want to talk about asset management and what asset management is. Asset management is the process of getting as much life and use as possible from every asset at the airport. Let me repeat that. The term asset management means it's a process that permits the airport to get the longest life from every asset. The longest life from the terminal, from a new terminal, the longest life from a new air conditioning system, the longest life from a runway, the longest life from a parking lot. What does that mean? It means two things. A system of preventive maintenance. Think of this. If you have an automobile, if you purchase an automobile, if you want that automobile to last as long as possible, you have to personally engage in asset management. What does that mean? Periodically, you have to take the automobile to the auto mechanic to change the oil. You have to change the fluids in the automobile. You have to wash and clean the automobile. So if you don't do those things to keep the automobile operating well, the automobile will not last as long as you expect. The same thing is true for airports. If you do not have preventive maintenance to keep the terminal as new as possible for as long as possible, you will have to replace that terminal prematurely. I would like to go back and talk about operations. When we talk about airport operations, we tend to divide it into three parts. We have landside operations. Landside operations is before the public enters the terminal. So it is the parking lot, it is the roadway, all those things that a passenger sees before you get into the terminal. Then you have terminal operations. I'm sorry, just a moment, I'm so sorry. The team at Aero Seville had cautioned me to make sure that all of my telephones were disconnected, and I left one in. I'm sorry about that. So, back to operations. Operations, there are three types of operations: landside, terminal, and airside. Landside operations is everything that a passenger sees before they get to the terminal. Terminal operations, that is everything that occurs within the terminal. The passenger check-in area, the security screening area, where you wait, where passenger waits to get onto the airplane. All of that is the terminal area, and you normally have a supervisor in the terminal to oversee that operation. Then you have the airside operation. What's the airside operations? The airside operations is where the airplane operates. It's where we call the sterile area, where the public is not permitted. It is where you have the, not just the airplanes, but it's also the runways and the taxiways and the grassy area around the runways and taxiways. The airside operations division has to ensure the safety of that area. What type of safety are we talking about? They have to ensure that there are no unauthorized people next to the aircraft. Operations also needs to make sure that there are no birds on the airfield. As you all know, birds should not be permitted on the airfield because a large bird can actually cause an aircraft to crash. If if a bird gets into the aircraft engine, especially when the aircraft is taking off, it can be one large bird or it can be a flock of small birds. If they get into the engine, it can cause a danger to the aircraft and the passengers on the aircraft. And here is where maintenance comes in. When we talk about operations and maintenance, maintenance not only provides the preventive maintenance to make sure that you get as much life out of what we call routine maintenance. So the elevators and escalators, they will service the elevators and escalators to make sure they last as long as possible. But they also must cut the grass on the airfield. Maintenance is responsible for making sure that the grass on the airfield gets cut. Why is that? The reason you want to cut the grass on the airfield is that you want to make, when grass grows to a certain height, it tends to attract rodents. It tends to attract insects and large rodents. Birds love to eat rodents and large insects. So if the grass is too high, it will attract rodents and large insects, which will attract birds, and that can be a danger to an airplane and to the people on that airplane. And so that's why I said to you that operations responsibility is to make sure there are no, not only to cut the grass, make sure the grass is cut by the maintenance division, but operations is responsible if they see a flock of birds, a group of birds on the airfield, they're responsible for making sure that those birds dissipate or go away. And they use things like a boom, something that sounds like a gun, which frightens the birds and cause them to fly away. So, in addition to these 5 divisions, of course, you have the legal affairs division. So at Air de Seville, for example, Miriam is the attorney, and usually every airport has legal counsel. Then there is public affairs, media affairs, and governmental affairs. Every airport needs to have a public and media affairs division, because it does not matter when, it's not a matter of when, something will always happen at the airport that will attract media and public attention. Sometimes it's something as simple as a storm that has caused delays at the airport, and the media comes to the airport to find out what is happening, why are the flights delayed, and so forth. I happen to have been working here in Atlanta when we had a crash of an airplane in the Everglades in Florida that was heading to Atlanta. I can tell you we had national media, and at the time I also had served as the head of public affairs and public relations. Perhaps the most difficult challenge I have ever had in my entire career from a public relations point of view was in 1996 when Atlanta hosted the Olympic Games. In 1996, when Atlanta hosted the Olympic Games, there was a bombing, an explosion at the Olympic Games in downtown Atlanta. So you would think if the bombing took place in downtown Atlanta during the Olympics, that would be where the media was. But all of the international media came to the airport. They were not downtown where the bombing was, they all came to the airport. So the airport had to be reporting on the bombing and so forth, and that was a very challenging time for us. But again, airports need to have a designated public relations person at the airport so that when something happens, when there's an incident, there is a trained professional, not the airport general manager, a trained professional who is trained in managing and dealing with the media. The same division should also deal with governmental affairs. Airports have to deal with three types of governments: the local governments, the regional governments, and the national governments. And airports have to deal with all. One of the most important ones is the local government. Every city where Aerocivil operates an airport, you know the importance of having a good relationship with the local government. One of the things I have learned over the years is that you should always maintain a good relationship with your local government. You should not wait until when you need something from the government to have a good relationship with them. Let me repeat that. You should not wait until when you need something from the local government to have a relationship with them. You should have a weekly relationship with them, a monthly relationship with them, advising them what it is that you're doing at the airport so that they can help you and participate to make those things easier for you to do. For example, as you know, whenever an airport wants to expand, if the airport wants to grow and expand, there is always an opposition from the people who live next to the airport. Whenever an airport wants to grow and expand because the number of passengers is growing, you must acquire land and purchase land around the airport. And I have done that several times, and it is always a challenge because the businesses and the people living close to the airport, they do not want their lives disrupted and interrupted. And the only way you can do that successfully, to purchase that land, is to have the support of the local government. But if you wait until when you're ready to expand the airport to get the support of the local government, it probably will not go very well. In English, we have a term where we say that, you know, your friends, someone is your friend all the time. If someone only wants to be your friend when they want something from you, some of you may have friends who only call you when they want to borrow something. They want to borrow your car, they want to borrow some money. But if that's the only time they're calling you, you will not have a very good relationship with them. The same is true with local governments. You should always maintain a weekly meeting, a monthly meeting with the local governments so that you can have a good relationship with them, so that when you do need to get something from them, they won't see you as just using them. And so, just to wrap up this slide, every airport, regardless of whether it is managed by the government, whether it is privatized, or this management model that we're going to discuss today typically have 5 departments: administration, information technology, finance and accounting, operations and maintenance, and finally, planning, engineering, and asset management. And those 5 departments are also supported by legal affairs, public, media, and governmental affairs. The next thing I'd like to do, you cannot discuss this new model that I will introduce you today, you cannot discuss a management model without first understanding the difference between a government managing the airport itself and privatization. Regardless of who it is, whether it's self-management or privatization, someone has to manage the daily operations of the airport. And so in the case of privatization, the private company manages the daily operations of the airport. The private company also takes the risk. It takes all of the financial risk away from the government, and the private company takes on the financial risk for managing that airport. It is typically a 15 to 30-year agreement. It is typically a 15 to 30-year agreement. Most privatization agreements that I've seen, and again, this is not a management agreement. I'm discussing privatization because if you do not understand privatization, it's difficult to understand the management agreement that I'm going to discuss. So for now, I'm talking to you about privatization, which you have had a lot of experience in. So in privatization, the private company oversees the daily operations. They risk all of their capital, so the risk is transferred from the government to the private company. Now, I wish to say something about the risk transfer. I have seen some private companies that want to sign an agreement with the government saying, we will run the airport and take the risk, but we have minimum profits that we would like to have. And if we don't have those minimum profits, the government will have to pay us to make up that money that we're not making. Let me repeat that. They say, we need to make a minimum amount of profits. And if we do not make that profit, the government has to pay us the difference between what we made and the profit we thought we were going to make. That is a poor privatization deal because that is not risk transfer. In that scenario, in that case, the government is still at risk. So in any privatization agreement, the private company should bear the full risk. That risk should be transferred from the government to the private company. And that's it. The government should have no more financial risk. Most private companies will not privatize an airport unless the airport has 2 million passengers a year. For the private company to make its return on investment, typically they will require that the airport has about 2 million passengers each year. Within a privatization agreement, the biggest risk for the private company, the largest risk for the private company, is the capital improvement program. In other words, in the privatization agreement, the private company will be required to build or repair or renew certain capital, what we call capital projects, during the term of the agreement. So they may have to build a new terminal. They may have to build a new runway. They may have to build a new parking lot. So all of those things must be specified in the agreement, that they have to build these new facilities, and it must specify that they must build these facilities within a certain period of time. So it could be that they have to build those facilities in the first 5 years, the first 3 years, the first 2 years. But in addition to specifying what the private company has to build, you should specify when they should complete those new facilities. In any privatization agreement, there's also an agreement as to the sharing of the revenue. When I say the sharing of the revenue, the private company must commit to what monies they will pay the government. And that can be done in different ways to determine how much the government is paid. There are different types of approaches, different types of methods. Most of the airports in India, for example, the private company has to pay the government on a per passenger basis. So they may have to pay the government $1 for every passenger that's processed through the airport, or $1.50 for every passenger that's processed through the airport. And so that is one method, and it's called the unit approach. It's per unit of passengers that the government gets paid by the private company. The other way is a percentage of the gross revenues that the company makes. So whatever the revenues that are created by the private company, they share a percentage of that revenue with the government. And that varies. Typically, it's between 6 to 8%, I have seen, of that revenue. But I have seen as much as 41%, which is really highly unusual. It's typically in the 6 to 8% range. In other cases, it depends on the type of revenue. So for example, the private company may pay a percentage of revenue on the food, beverage, and retail concessions, the commercial operations. So they may pay the airport 20% of that revenue or 25% of that revenue. But on the aeronautical portions of the revenue, for the funds they get paid from the airlines, the parking revenue for the planes, the lease revenue for the airlines, they may pay a lower percentage, maybe 6 or 7 or 8% of that revenue. So there are different methods in terms of how you determine what the private company pays the government for the privilege of privatizing the airport. One of the reasons that governments cite for privatizing airports, of course, is the private company brings the capital. The private company brings the capital that the government does not have. So the private company brings the finances to finance the growth of the airport, to modernize and build new airports. Governments also cite a reduction in political interference. What do I mean by a reduction in political interference? Well, if you are the CEO of an airport, it is possible that you will get a call from someone in the government, sometimes even a minister, saying that you need to hire someone. They need to hire a family member. You need to hire, I have had that experience in several cities where you get a call from the mayor of the city or some political official saying, Miguel, you must hire such and such a person. And you may not need that employee. You probably don't need that employee because you do not have a vacancy. And so you end up having more employees at government-run airports than you actually need. I'll give you a specific example. In Jamaica, Norman Manley Airport in Kingston, Jamaica, the main city in Jamaica, was privatized. When the government ran the airport, there were 325 employees that ran the airport when the government ran the airport. When the private company took over, 1 year after the private company took over, there were only 100 people running the airport. The number of people were reduced from 325 airport employees to approximately 100 employees. 1/3 of the people that the government had running the airport was now being used by the private company. And the airport still operates very safely, very efficiently, and they are doing the same amount of work as when the government was running the airport, with 200 less employees. And so that's what privatization does, because the private company is looking to maximize its return on investment while still running a safe and secure airport. Now, you may be asking the question, well, how can the private company do that? How can they reduce the number of employees from 325 to 100 and still run the airport? Well, for example, when the government ran the airport, you have different, like 3 shifts of firefighters. And the firefighters at the airport, the firemen and women, there were 3 shifts, each working 8 hours per shift. Well, because you have to have the fire protection 24 hours. And so what the private company did was they said, well, for most of the night, we do not have any flights. So rather than have 3 shifts, they have 24-hour shifts. So people work longer shifts, 2.5 days per week. And so these are some innovative ideas that the private company has that gives them the ability to reduce the number of people. So 2 of the things what privatization does, it builds efficiencies. Now, private companies don't do this because they love the country or they love the people of the country. They do this to make a big profit. And privatization is about trying to make a big profit. Generally, in Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, the developing parts of the world, the annual return on investment that a private company is looking for is about 25 to 35% annual return on their investment. So they refer to it as the internal rate of return. And all the internal rate of return does is the private company looks at the time or the duration of the agreement, say 20 years. And they look at the entire time of that agreement, and they run these financial models. They run a financial model, and that financial model must produce over those 20 years an annual return, not a one-time return, an annual return on their investment of 25 to 35%. per year. And you may think that is a very high return on investment, and it is. Here is my recommendation in terms of how you should approach privatization. Airports should approach privatization the same way any of you in this audience approaches purchasing a home. Let me repeat that. Airports should approach privatization in the same manner as any of you on the phone would approach purchasing a home. If you're going to purchase a home and a residence, the best way to do it is if you have the money, if you have cash. If you have cash, you should use your cash to purchase the home. Because when you pay interest, the interest becomes expensive. But if you borrow money, you have to pay interest. So if you have the cash, if you're lucky enough to have the cash, you want to use your own cash to purchase the home. If you don't have the money to buy the home, the next thing you should do is to try and get the cheapest, the least expensive money in terms of borrowing the money. You want to get the least expensive. And the least expensive normally is going to your mom or dad, going to your sister, going to your grandparents to try and get them to lend you some money. You will probably get a very good interest rate from a relative. So if you go to a relative who has money, who can lend you the money, you will probably get the lowest interest rate, the least expensive money to build your home. But most of us don't have the cash to buy a home. Most of us don't have a rich uncle or rich parents to buy the home. So most of us have to go to a bank. When we go to the bank, we go to several banks. We always want to go to 2 or 3 banks. Why? Why do we want to go to several banks? To make sure we go to the bank with the lowest interest rate. You want to go to the bank that's going to give you the lowest interest rate. And the bank that gives you the lowest interest rate, that's the bank you choose with which to take the loan. If you have a bank that charges you 20% for a loan and a bank that charges you 15%, you will go with the bank that gives you 15%. If you want to borrow money from a bank and one bank offers you 10% and another bank offers you 5%, which one are you going to go with? You're going to go with the one that gives you 5%, the one that gives you the lowest interest rate. That is how airports, government should approach airport privatization. They want to do, because all privatization is one option to finance the building of infrastructure at airports. That's all privatization is. It's one option, one alternative for financing the development of airport infrastructure. Just one option. If the airport has the cash or the government has the cash, that's an option. If the government has to borrow, if the government needs to borrow money, they can borrow money by selling bonds, what we call bonds, or they can go privatization. And so if the country has a good credit rating, they can borrow money. For example, the Bahamas. In the Bahamas, they just borrowed money through the bond market, and the Bahamas does not have a really great credit rating. It does not have a great credit rating, but they're able to borrow $600 million at a little over 9%, at a little over 9%. And the Bahamas government just did that. Now, so what I'm saying to you is that when an airport is trying to decide how it's going to finance the development of its airports, it should compare all the various methods that it has in terms of getting the lowest cost of money. The lowest cost of money meaning the lowest interest. So the cost of privatization is high. It will be between 25 to 35%. If you can find an option that, and by the way, this is good. I mean, I am a supporter of privatization if you're not able to find financing at a lower rate, whether you use the cash, your own monies, or you do the bond market like the Bahamas did. So that's what I would recommend in terms of your approach to privatization, whether or not you privatize or whether or not you use another option to build your airport infrastructure. Okay, so now we'd like to spend the next 15 minutes or so to talk about what an airport management agreement looks like, what the model looks like. The one thing is that Air Civil will retain the ownership of the airport. The ownership of the airport does not change. It does not go to a private company. Air Civil still owns and operates the airport. The only exception is that instead of Air Civil managing the airport, they pay a professional airport management company to run the day-to-day operations. That's the only difference. Air Civil, unlike privatization, because in privatization, the private company now runs the airport, not Air Civil. In an airport management agreement, Air Civil still keeps control of the airport. The control does not go to the private company. Air Civil oversees the private company. So Air Civil still owns the airport, but it hires a professional management company to run the day-to-day operations of the airport. The management agreements at airports can be for a portion of the airport, or it can be for the entire airport. For example, in Atlanta, there is a management company that manages the international terminal. That's all they manage, just the international terminal operations. You can also have a management company not run the entire airport, but just the domestic terminal operations. You can also have a management company only run the common use facilities. The common use facilities, for example, there may be an airline that has its own equipment, its own terminal, and its own facilities at the airport. And so the airline or the government could run that terminal. But for all the other facilities where it's used by different airlines that are what we call common use, you can also have a management company just to do that. Or you can have a management company. In the case of Atlanta's airport, a management company runs the international terminal as well as the common use facilities. In several cases, however, the management company can run the entire airport. The management company can run the entire airport, such as in Gary, Indiana, in the United States, and the government of Puerto Rico is currently negotiating an agreement for a management company to run all of its airports. And so, again, the management company can run a portion of the airport or all of the airport. The term of the agreement can be whatever Air Civil wants. You can do 3 years. I would not recommend 3 years because you will not get too many companies proposing. I would recommend, especially if you're going to test it, that it's a 5-year agreement with an option, an Aero Civil option at the end of those 5 years to extend it for 2 more years at the sole discretion and option of Aero Civil. The scope of services is the same as anybody running an airport. Remember, we talked about those 5 things. The scope of services is the administration, the financial, the IT, the financial accounting, the operations and maintenance, and the planning, engineering, and asset management. Now, I want to point out that this is typically when an airport management company runs an airport, it runs everything. But the wonderful thing about a management agreement is that Aero Civil can determine what portions of the airport it may want to keep. In other words, Aero Civil can have the management company run the entire airport, but there may be some functions with which Aero Civil is uncomfortable and does not want the management company to do. So, over the last year, for example, in working with Aero Civil has said, of course, it wants to retain air traffic control, the weather service, and the weather management office. But in the airport itself, Aero Civil has said that it wants to issue the invoices and collect all the revenues from the tenants and the airlines. In other words, Aero Civil does not want to risk the management company collecting the revenues that are made at the airport. So all the management company does is record all of the activities at the airport. So the number of flights that arrive, the number of passengers, all the things, all the data that Aero Civil needs to invoice the tenants, the airlines, and collect the revenue. The management company collects that data and sends it to Aero Civil for the central office of Aero Civil's finance and accounting to process the invoices, and those revenues go directly from the tenants to Aero Civil. The other thing that Aero Civil is keeping, and this is also very common in a management agreement, is the Capital Improvement Program, or the CIP. What is the Capital Improvement Program? Any new construction or major repairs that are required at the airport, that is still the responsibility of Aero Civil. So if you need a new runway, if they need a new terminal, if they need to expand the terminal, expand the runway, if they need to put a new layer on the runway, all those major capital projects are still the responsibility of Aero Civil. So the 2 things that Aero Civil still will continue to do in the operations, which is an option for them, is to collect the revenue. Aero Civil still does that. And the Capital Improvement Program, Aero Civil will still do that. Now, later today, we'll have a workshop and we'll talk about how the funding works, because since Aero Civil still owns the airport, Aero Civil also has to provide the funding to the management company so that the management company can do the day-to-day operations. So we'll talk about that this afternoon in greater detail. Again, I want to remind everyone that the control and the risk still remains with Aero Civil. Unlike a privatization agreement where the private company takes control, in a management agreement, Aero Civil still manages it. But it's the private professional company that's running the airport for Air Civil. Now, you might ask yourself, well, how can Air Civil be confident that the management company will do a good job? How can we ensure excellence in terms of the professional management company doing what they're supposed to do? Well, in the management agreement, it must establish standards of performance. And those standards of performance are international. ICAO Annex 14, FAA Part 139, RAC 14, RAC 200, RAC 160, and TSA security. All of those requirements and standards must be in the agreement for the management company to meet. Air Civil in the agreement must also establish some key performance indices. Now, many of you in this audience will say, well, there are 50 different things that a management company has to do on an airport. But really, rather than developing key performance indices to determine the excellence of the company on these 50 things, you choose those core items, key, that's why they call it key performance indices, that if they're not done well, the airport will not operate properly. But if they're done well, the airport will operate very well. And those key performance indices are safety. Safety is number one at airports. And that can be assured by an annual audit of RAC or ICAO. Budget. You want to ensure that the management company keep expenses to a minimum and grow the revenue as much as possible. You want to ensure that the management company keeps expenses to a minimum and grow the revenue as much as possible. And of course, you want them to do this and still have customer service excellence. Must have customer service excellence. Generally, in terms of compensation, the management companies will generally charge between 6 to 10% of the annual budget. It says 8%, but it's typically between 6 to 10%. So the smaller the airport operations, the higher the percentage, probably closer to 8 to 10%. But the larger the airport, then the percentage compensation is lower, about 6%. And you incentivize the management company to do an excellent job by having an incentive program and what I call reverse compensation, where you punish the company if it does not do a good job. So for example, if customer service is improved by 10% one year, you could pay the company $10,000. For every 10% improvement in customer service, the company may be paid, the management company is paid an extra $10,000. If the company fails its safety inspection, you deduct $10,000 or an amount from the annual fee. And that's how you promote excellence, by rewarding the company, giving them extra compensation when they do an excellent job. But if they don't do a good job, you punish them by reducing the compensation that they get. Okay, I will just go through this very quickly, but when you're recruiting a company like this, there are only a few companies in the world that actually do this work, probably not more than 6 companies. And of course, the first thing you need to do is to make sure you have a good solicitation document, or what we call a request for proposal, or RFP. And in that RFP, the two most important things, these are very crucial, are the scope of services and the draft of a management contract. The draft of a management contract. The reason the draft of the management contract is very important is the companies that are providing a proposal need to understand as best as possible before they make the proposal what the agreement looks like. What are the components of the agreement? What are the commitments that they're going to make? So in addition to the scope of services, when you send out or distribute your RFP, it should have a draft agreement, which the management company will want to negotiate anyway. But most of the understandings will have already been established. So the management company will know in advance what it is they're proposing to. And that's why the draft agreement is so important. And I would recommend that you have no less than 60 days, 60 days for the companies to respond from the time you issue the RFP. The composition of the selection committee. You should determine who the people are in Île Seville who will be on the selection committee. You should determine that as soon as you prepare the RFP. Don't wait for the proposals to come in to put together your committee. And the committee should have a diverse set of people from Île Seville. You should have operations people, commercial people, administration people like Claudia, planning and engineering people. You should have all the various operating parts of an airport. You should have people representing that area of business on the selection committee when you're choosing which management company to use. There are a number of places you can promote the RFP. You want to make sure as many companies know about the RFP as possible. But the good news is there are only like 6 companies in the world that are interested in these projects. I'm not going to mention their names because I don't want to promote some and not the others. But there are only like 6 companies that do this kind of work in the world. So it should be easy. And there will be others who may want to come into the market as well. The last thing is the negotiation process. You should not have to do a lot of negotiating because you had included the draft management agreement in the RFP. So you should not have to negotiate and make many changes to the contract. And with that, I'm open for questions. I'll do my best to answer all of your questions. Thank you very much for letting me be with you this afternoon.
Así es, Mr. Southwell. Muchísimas gracias.
That's right, Mr. Southwell. Thank you very much for your presentation. We now give the floor to Lina in order to start the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yes, that's right, Mr. Southwell. Viviana, thank you very much for the introduction to the Q&A session, Mr. Southwell. Thank you very much for your presentation, for sharing that important knowledge at the service of the industry. And at this moment, we will start the Q&A session. And our participants have posted some questions. We have answered some of them in writing, and we will address the other questions here live that we have received through the Q&A module. We will get started now. The first question that we have is how this organization structure changes for the smaller airports that are necessary for the connectivity of remote regions, but that have low levels of air traffic that are usually are deficient, that they usually don't produce revenues?
The approach that I would recommend is to combine several airports in one management agreement. So for example, if you are going to use a management agreement, you would want to combine San Andreas with Providencia and do only one agreement so that you can build, for the management company, the size of the responsibility will increase by adding airports in a region to the single agreement. In this way, it'll make it more attractive for those management companies.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Now we have another question, a second question. The question is, what is the experience in the United States for managing these smaller airports that are very important for the regions where they're located?
The management agreement here in the United States is very limited in terms of its application. Most of the airports in the United States are operated by the governments themselves, which can either be the city or the county. Here in Atlanta, so what you see in the United States is less of the entire airport, but typically only portions of the airport, such as the international terminal here in Atlanta. And also where you have common use terminal, meaning that portion of the terminal that is not dedicated to a particular airline, where all the airlines can use it. Those areas called common use terminals lend themselves to a management agreement because you have to have an objective third party operating and managing the facility to ensure that no single airline gets preference and that all the airlines are treated equally in a common use setting. And so here in the United States, you have Gary, Indiana, and I think Stanford. There's some limited use of management agreements, but there are uses of management agreements in portions of airport, not the entire airport.
Perfecto, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And I think we have another question here. And the question is if they're going to get the presentation and the recording of this webinar. At the end, we will provide the link for the website where you will be able to find all of this information that very kindly Mr. Miguel Southwell will be sharing with us and that we can share with you, our audience, as well. As far as other questions, we also have a question. How long the negotiation model or the agreement usually shows results? I mean, how long does it take for it to show some results?
Typically within a year. What you would like to do, and in this afternoon's workshop, we will talk about the transition process, transferring the operation from the government or the private company to the management company. You would see results within a year. The most obvious results that you will see is in the staffing, because the management company, of course, will bring some of its own experts in the staffing, and that is needed to also help with the transition. That is not to say that they will not, the management company will always give first preference. They will always give first preference to the employees that are there. They will choose from those employees and of course the best employees. They will always give them that first preference. But the management company will bring its own people in the beginning to make sure that it can perform the changes that it needs to perform. Because if it doesn't do that, and they have the existing people try to make the changes, it's normally not successful because, of course, the people who are already there tend not to want changes.
Gracias por tu
Thank you
respuesta.
very much for your answer, Miguel. We have many questions, but now we have one that says, what is the difference between the proposed model and what we currently have in Colombia?
Well, in Colombia, you have both privatization models as well as Aero Civil operates some of its airports. And so we did if you once the presentation is distributed, you can go back to that slide where I talked about self-governance of the airport and privatization and the differences. And so we point out the main differences there. But again, the main difference here with the management model is that Aero Civil does not give up control. In privatization, it gives up control of the airport. Aero Civil does not give up control of the airport. The term of the agreement is much shorter because the agreement can be 5 years with 2 optional years of extension. In a privatization deal, I've seen them that are 15 to 30 years. So the government loses control for 15 to 30 years. With a management agreement, you have more flexibility because you can determine very quickly whether the management company is making a difference. And if it doesn't make a difference within 5 years, you can replace them with another management company. It's almost like an employee, a contract employee. You know, you can hire the reason you may have a contractor who cuts the grass on the airfield. If they're not cutting the grass and doing a good job, you don't have to wait 15 years to get rid of them. You know, you can replace them with a better company. And so it's just the key things are that Aero Civil maintains control, but it gives the responsibility to a professional management company to run the airport, as opposed to using its own employees. And some of that risk, the risk doesn't get transferred, but the responsibilities do. So the management company, for example, has to build a relationship with the local governments, etc.
Perfecto.
Perfect. Mr. Southwell, we have a lot of participation from the audience. We will address another question. The private entities have the right to demand compensation from the government due to the pandemic, or they have to take the risk themselves. What is your opinion?
Well, all of the private companies today are requesting not compensation from the governments, but they're requesting an extension of their agreements. An extension in the term. So in a privatization deal, maybe the original agreement was 15 years, or maybe the agreement is set to expire in 3 years. So the private company will come to the government of Colombia and Aero Civil and say, well, the term of my private agreement expires in 3 years, but because of COVID, we didn't make any money, so could you add another 3 years or 5 years? I know of one situation where because of the 1.5 years of COVID, they're requesting an additional 7 years, you know, because they're saying that's how long it's going to take for the traffic to come back. And so right now, all across the world where you have private deals, the private companies are requesting an extension of the agreement. In some cases, they're also asking the government for relief in terms of the capital investment. So if the private company was supposed to invest $50 million over the last 5 years, they have said, because we have not made any revenue this year, can we, instead of investing that $50 million over the next 2 or 3 years? Can we invest that 5 years, over the next 5 years? So the private companies, they're not asking the government to give them any money. They're doing it in an indirect way. They're asking the government to extend the term of their private agreements, and they're also asking the government for relief by pushing further out into the future the requirement of the private company to spend significant capital dollars to build new equipment or to build new infrastructure such as runways and terminals, so that they can defer or push those costs into the future. So those are the two main types of relief that the private companies are seeking.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Southwell. We also have another question here, which is how can we eliminate this stigma that every public company is inefficient in managing the airports, and that's why privatization is necessary? How can we avoid that?
That's an excellent question, because I have worked for governments in Atlanta, Miami, Birmingham, Alabama, and it is a very difficult stigma. For the main reason is because the governments themselves have established terms. So the government may have 4 or 5 year terms for the government to be in power. And so one government may make a commitment or to make changes to get rid of corruption, or to not engage in things like having too many people work at the airport because you want to compensate the people who help you get elected and all of that. And one government can make that commitment, but then the government changes, and 4 or 5 years later, the old practices return. And so, that has given way to privatization, and it has given way to management agreements. And both type of agreements can help with that. I have not seen in 35 years any sustainable method of keeping bad behavior, I will call it, bad behavior by elected officials away from airports. Normally, you get a period of about 7 years where everything goes well, and then after about 7 years, the government may change or may not change, and the practices begin again. And so the public, when these things get disclosed, just when you think you're rebuilding the reputation, some public official does something, and then the reputation gets damaged again. You're not alone. Every place in the United States, the belief by the public is that if you want to do business with an airport, you have to know somebody or pay somebody to do business in the airport. And it doesn't matter whether you're in Jamaica, Antigua. It doesn't matter if you're in Nevada, New York, Detroit. That reputation exists. And it is very unfortunate. It is very unfortunate because in the 35 years that I've worked at an airport, I have never met a dishonest employee. All the employees that I've dealt with at many airports around this country and in the region, the Caribbean, Latin America, the employees are all honest, people of integrity. They're really professionals. The problem is not with the airport professionals, it is typically caused by elected officials. And, you know, you ask me a question and I'll have to give you the honest truth. The problem is never with the professionals who work at the airports. It's normally with the elected officials. I teach, one of the classes I teach for ACI, excuse me, is a class by the name of Airport Ethics. Airport Ethics. So ethical behavior at airports. And I've taught it in Guam, Asia. I've taught it in the Caribbean. It's one of the most requested classes. Governments always want to know, you know, how to have a more honest, ethical behavior. And I'm always saddened because I was once the president of the Latin America and Caribbean region of ACI. And I would have an airport CEO give me a call and they'd say, Mr. Southwell, I need to get your advice because I'm having a problem and I don't know what to do. And this used to happen frequently. And one of the questions, for example, I remember one airport CEO calling and said, my prime minister, there is an election, an upcoming national election that's coming up. And my prime minister has asked me to write a check for $10,000 for his campaign. And he said, if I don't do it, that I'm going to get fired. What do I do, Mr. Southwell? And my answer was very direct. I said, well, it's illegal in your country to do that. Do you want your family to see you go to jail? And I imagine the answer to that question is no. And so I said, in that case, you know what to do. And so it is a problem, but it's a problem. I have known several officials, including the mayor of a city, who was sent to prison here in the United States. It happens more than you think. So I don't know what the solution is. I continue to have hope with the airport professionals because it is the airport professionals that have demonstrated the integrity and honesty that really keep the airports going.
Miguel, muchísimas gracias.
Miguel, thank you very much. We have a question here. There's combinations of airlines that manage airports. If there are any, give me an example of an airport that is actually managed by the airliners.
Yeah, so and there are no airports that are managed by an airline. They're terminals, airport terminals that are managed by an airline. So for example, at JFK, the JFK, the new international terminal, is owned by Delta, as well as a company from Amsterdam that jointly operate the terminal. But the Delta not only, so they've privatized the terminal, but Delta is one of the owners and private companies. And so, for example, when that happens, it's a bit of an airport such as Atlanta, for example, which is Delta's headquarters. You have to make sure that an airline doesn't move its international flights to a new terminal like JFK, where they own the terminal, so that that terminal will get more business than another airport, because you see, that's their terminal. So, you know, you have to manage that to make sure that is not happening. And so it's not unusual. For example, even though in Miami-Dade County, the county manages the American Airlines North Terminal. I can tell you, in reality, it is American Airlines that runs the North Terminal at that airport. And even here in Atlanta, there are large terminals that are generally overseen by the airline itself, such as Concourse E here in Atlanta. So there are no examples that I know of where the airline is running the entire airport, but they run portions of it.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. Miguel, we have another question here. They ask, could you please tell us what is the agreement model for airports? How would investment in infrastructure take place? Would the investment would be by Aerocivil?
Yes, that is one thing that is retained by Aerocivil is the capital infrastructure. So if you want to expand the airport, again, Aerocivil, under a management agreement, keeps control, and it keeps all the risk, but it also gets all of the rewards. So the more efficient that the management company runs the airport, the more money that Aerocivil makes. So the day-to-day operations, it's done by the management company. Aerocivil is not involved in the day-to-day operations, but the Aerocivil gets the revenue, all of the revenue. Aerocivil does not have to share the revenue, but it also has to still invest in the infrastructure in terms of the capital costs, the runways, the taxiways, expanding the new terminal. For example, in San Andreas and Providencia after the storm, on the management agreement, Aerocivil would still have to be at the cost of that repair for the capital program.
Queremos hacer un recordatorio.
Okay, we want to give you a brief reminder, those that are connecting right now. We're about to finish this webinar, this conference by Mr. Miguel Southwell. We want to remind you that we have the interpretation service. If you wish to listen in Spanish, you can have access by clicking in the world icon that is in the bottom of the Zoom app, and you can have access to simultaneous translation that is being provided at this moment. We have another question from Mexico. Mr. Raul Mendoza is saying, I live in the city of Mexico, and in my country, the COVID rates are increasing again. I would like to know the opinion of Mr. Southwell whether aviation can see another recession such as the one that we had last year, and what will be the best way to face the risk of another health emergency so that we can address it in our beautiful industry. I mean, how can this industry help this situation that is taking place?
Well, I believe we're at the tail end. We're at the end of the COVID crisis. I believe that the issue is one of vaccination, and that when we have enough of the people vaccinated, that it will become as common as the flu or the cold, where you have to get an annual or periodic vaccination to keep your immunity. Judging from what I have seen, primarily with the cruise lines and the booking of cruises, judging from what I've seen, I think we will come back, the industry will come back very quickly. Once people are vaccinated, and regardless of where you are, whether you're in Mexico or, I can tell you that if you try to book, especially in the high-end luxury hotels, if you try to book a vacation in December in luxury hotels, you cannot. All of those bookings are gone. And those bookings are primarily by the first population that got vaccinated in the world, which is the people who are over 60 years of age. You know, they go 60, then 55, then 50. All of those people have taken much of the hotel accommodations for this Christmas season. So because they have all been vaccinated, we believe that those younger population, that they will do the same thing once they get vaccinated, and that we will really see a spike, a pent-up demand for travel, especially to tropical places, especially to places like Mexico, because, of course, I was invited by the Mexican government about 4 years ago. They have an annual tourism conference. And I was asked to speak on the future traveler, the future traveler. Who is the future tourist? What is the profile? How does that person, and the future traveler, of course, is the millennial. And you know, it's a different type of travel. They require different things. They're more into health and adventure. They don't want to just lay on the beaches and so forth. And they want to dive with the sharks. They want to dive off cliffs. They want to go hiking. So the future tourist is going to be different. And Mexico has done a really great job in transitioning to that type of tourists. One of the things I've noticed, for example, is that in the last 5 years, I have had several friends contact me and said, "You have to go to Cartagena. It's an amazing place." And I never, 10 years ago, nobody was talking about Cartagena, but Americans cannot get enough of Cartagena. And I think it's the topography, where you have the lush forest and the environment, and you can hike and you can do bungee jumping, all those kinds of things. And I think people's vacations are put on hold because of that, and there's a pent-up demand for that. So I think these vacation destinations, whether it's Cartagena or Mexico, I think they're going to do well. I believe it's going to be another 9 months before much of the world gets fully vaccinated. But after that, we'll be fine. And let me say this. We are better prepared in terms of technology and airport, in terms of the pharmaceutical industry and airport processes. We're better prepared for future viruses, because we will have a future virus that we don't have today. But we're so much better prepared to deal with it because we never thought this could happen. And because it has happened, it has made us better prepared.
Miguel, muchas gracias.
Miguel, thank you very much. You are always welcome to Colombia, to Cartagena, to Bogota. This country always welcomes you. We will have another question by Mario. Do you consider this business model an outsourcing for administration and business operations that we don't have in the country yet? And can we get to it in this country?
The answer is yes. I mean, I don't like to put labels on things. So outsourcing is a label, but it gives the correct concept of what this is. It's really, outsourcing is normally defined as having, hiring a third party. And that's what this is, hiring a third party to do a job for you. But you know, airports are already outsourcing. Air Civil is already outsourcing. I mean, Air Civil does not cut its own grass. It doesn't have employees that cut its own grass. It has a contractor to do that. You know, so it's new in terms of the extent of it, but the concept is already being used in little portions across the airport, whether it's cutting the grass and the maintenance, because it's really a concept of not using your own employees, but using a professional to do it. And so typically airports outsource, historically, airports only outsource those things where they have a high turnover rate, a high employee turnover rate. So any activity that airports have where you have a high turnover rate of employees, and maintenance is one of those. Maintenance at airports, you have a high turnover rate of employees. Employees come in, they work, and the work is difficult, and so they leave very quickly. And so historically, airports have normally outsourced that or contracted that out. So think of a management agreement of just taking that to the next level, where it's the entire airport, not just the maintenance people who cut the grass.
Perfecto, señor Sadwell.
Okay, perfect, Mr. Southwell. Thank you very much for this picture. We have a chat with a lot of questions still. And the question is, good afternoon. Should the state at a private property airport where the state only grants the permit of operations as a public airport have some benefits from that operation, receive some revenues?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure, no problem. Should the state in a private property airport, the only thing the state does is to oversee the operation or issue a permit, should the state receive benefits from those operations? A fully private airport?
Yes, I mean, for the things that the state should get compensated for any service that it provides to a private airport. So if the state provides air traffic control, which the state should provide some form of air traffic control, because that airport's private operation affects the airspace system. And so if the state should be compensated for air traffic control, the state should be compensated like any privately owned property. If it collects property taxes, for example, the state should be compensated, should be paid property taxes for the state's role in being able to facilitate and sustain that airport. What do I mean? The state has roads that go to that airport. And so there are roads leading to that private airport. And so if there are roads leading to that private airport that the state has to maintain, then clearly the state has to collect property taxes. So that private airport, there are really two forms of compensation that the state should be collecting. One is property taxes, where the state gets compensated for things like the roads it has to maintain, or anything that permits that private airport to exist, any infrastructure that the state has to provide and maintain to permit that private airport to exist, which is normally a property tax. And the state should also be compensated if it provides other services directly related to the operation of the airport, such as for air traffic control.
Thank you very much, Miguel. We have another question here. Alejandro is saying that he understands that you cannot mention the 6 companies that might be interested in this type of projects. So how could we find them then?
Well, I can share those with you, but not on the conference call, because I will inevitably forget the names of 1 or 2 and get a call from them saying, why didn't you mention my company? So I can provide that to you afterwards.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Southwell. We have another question also here by John. Sometimes the relationship between the airports and air traffic control go separate ways. What is your strategy to make these 2 areas work together, or how can we integrate them as one service?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes. The question is that sometimes the relationship between the airport or the airport operator and air traffic control goes separate ways. What strategies do you recommend in order to make this a comprehensive service in both areas, that they get along, basically?
Okay. In the case of Air Civil, that is not a problem. This is only a problem when you have air traffic control that controls the landing of the aircraft on the runway and then onto the parking area. And you have separately what we call a ramp control tower. So for large airports, very large airports, you have, in addition to the air traffic control, which guides the aircraft into the airport can be so large that for different parts of the airport, you will have what you call a ramp control tower, which sits on top of the terminal. You have to have this because the people in the control tower cannot see parts of the terminal. So if the main air traffic control tower cannot see parts of the terminal, then a ramp control tower has to guide the aircraft to the gate and away from the gate. And once the aircraft leaves the gate, then to take off, then the air traffic control takes command of the aircraft. And that is where you need really close coordination between the air traffic control tower, the main air traffic control tower, and the ramp control tower. I've been told that in Colombia, there are no ramp control towers. All the airports have the air traffic control tower, the main air traffic control tower, guide the aircraft in and guide the aircraft to the gate. And when the aircraft leaves, the aircraft is guided by the same air traffic control tower. So there's less coordination. The only coordination you need is for what you call there's something called marshalling. If you are on an aircraft, you will see these people with the orange lights, the red orange lights, going like this, guiding the captain into the gate. That process is called the marshalling of the aircraft. And the people who are doing that are in constant radio communication with the air traffic control tower. And that communication is absolutely essential. It has to be a close coordination. And so that is already taking place at Air Civil airports.
Miguel, queremos darte las gracias.
Miguel, we want to thank you very much for joining us with these questions. We have a chat that is very active, but so far we have ran out of time. So thank you very much for sharing your knowledge for Aeronáutica Civil and the Center of Aeronautical Studies. It was a great pleasure to have you today. To all of the participants that were active in the chat, thank you very much. We also want to say our special guest, CLAP ICAO, the national industry, international industry, that were with us today. We want to thank you, and we have the production of the Group of Institutional Affairs of the Center of Aeronautical Studies, the support of the commercialization of investments of the Aeronáutica Civil, and the interpretation that we will be able to enjoy through iTranslate. Thank you very much for your participation, and we will see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.